There's a map that was made just before Christopher Columbus set sail, and on that map, where the Americas should be, there's basically nothing. A few vague notes about some island the Vikings claimed to have found somewhere out west. Nobody took it seriously. Nobody thought it mattered. That's where this story starts. Columbus wasn't trying to find a new world, he was trying to find a shortcut to Asia. The idea was simple: sail west, reach India, come back rich. What he actually found was a handful of Caribbean islands that had no spices, no silk, and no obvious connection to Asia whatsoever. But he came back with gold, and gold, it turned out, was enough. So when he showed up in front of the King and Queen of Spain, the conversation went something like this: "Great voyage, Columbus. Where are the spices?" "Well, no spices yet. But there's gold. Lots of it. Perfect. Go back. Tell everyone to become Christians and bring more gold." And that was pretty much the blueprint for everything that followed. Spain and Portugal were the two big players at this point, and they weren't interested in sharing. So they literally drew a line down the middle of the map and divided the non-Christian world between them. Portugal got one side, Spain got the other. Portugal sailed east around Africa and built a massive trading empire in Asia. Spain headed west and started conquering everything in sight. Here's the thing about North America in those early years: nobody wanted it. All the interesting stuff, the gold, the silver, the large civilizations to conquer, was down in Central and South America. That's where Spain focused. They did send an expedition into North America in 1539, but they didn't find gold or silver, so they mostly shrugged and moved on. For over a century, the lands that would eventually become the United States were treated as an inconvenient obstacle between Europe and more valuable places. England was paying attention, though. They sent an explorer to North America, while Spain was still poking around the Caribbean islands. But after that early expedition, the English also lost interest for nearly 100 years. When they finally got serious about colonising, their first attempt at Roanoke in 1585 ended in one of history's most enduring mysteries. The colony vanished, completely. Nobody has ever fully explained it. Their second attempt was Jamestown. That one stuck. Then came Plymouth. The Pilgrims were deeply religious, strictly so, the kind of people who outlawed gambling and considered celebrating Christmas dangerously frivolous. They weren't exactly the life of the party, but they came, and others followed, and before long the entire eastern coastline was filling up with British settlements. While the British were building colonies along the coast, the French were quietly claiming everything in the middle. And by 1754, all that overlapping ambition was finally going to have to get sorted out. France controlled an enormous stretch of territory, but had only about 60,000 settlers spread across it. The British colonies had over 1 million people. When war broke out, the French and Indian War, named for the alliance France built with various native tribes, the numbers told most of the story. The British won, decisively. The war in America was part of a larger conflict in Europe, and when the whole thing was finally settled, the map got redrawn dramatically. France gave half of Louisiana to Spain before the war ended to keep it out of British hands, then handed the other half of Louisiana to Britain anyway, along with Canada. France essentially walked away from North America almost entirely. Britain now had an enormous amount of land. It also had an enormous amount of debt from paying for the war, and somebody had to cover that. The somebody they had in mind was the colonies. The colonies had a different perspective on this. The way they saw it, they'd been doing most of the actual fighting and dying. They didn't feel like they owed Britain anything. And the idea of being taxed by a government they had no vote in was, to put it gently, not well received. The disagreement escalated. The disagreement became a conflict. The conflict became a revolution. On the 4th of July, 1776, the Americans declared their independence. But declaring independence and actually winning independence are two different things. It took 5 more years of war before Britain accepted the reality, and even after victory the new country had serious problems. The 13 colonies had essentially become 13 separate little countries, held together by almost nothing. The central government was nearly powerless. The whole experiment was on the verge of collapsing before it had really begun. So the founders went back to the drawing board. They wrote a new constitution, built a functioning federal government from scratch, and in 1789, George Washington became the first president of a country that had finally figured out how to actually be a country. The United States at that point was a narrow strip along the eastern coast. Everything to the west and south belonged to Spain. The new nation was functional, but it was small. There were theatres, restaurants, newspapers, a Chinatown that was the largest Chinese community outside of Asia, neighbourhoods full of Victorian houses climbing up hills that gave extraordinary views of the bay. The city understood itself as the great city of the American West. Not a frontier town anymore, not a temporary camp, but a real place with a real future. Under all of it ran the Hayward and San Andreas fault lines. This was not a secret. The region had experienced earthquakes before. The geological reality of the Bay Area was visible to anyone who looked at the landscape with serious attention. But the relationship between knowing a risk exists and acting on that knowledge is more complicated than it sounds, especially when acting on it would be expensive and inconvenient, and the risk has not materialized recently enough to feel urgent. The city's water infrastructure was inadequate for a major fire. This was documented. Engineers had written reports. The reports had been received by city officials. The city continued to grow, and the water system continued to be what it was. On the evening of April 17th, the city went about its ordinary business. At the Opera House, Enrico Caruso was performing in Carmen. He was one of the most famous singers in the world, and the performance that night was, by all accounts, extraordinary. The audience included much of the city's social elite. Caruso, who was staying at the Palace Hotel, went to bed that night in one of the finest rooms in one of the finest hotels west of Chicago. In the working-class neighborhood south of Market Street, families went to bed in wooden houses that had been standing for 20 or 30 years. Fishermen along the waterfront were preparing for the early morning. Bakers were starting their overnight shifts. The city that never entirely sleeps was doing what it always did in the hours before dawn. At the Mechanics Pavilion, a large arena near City Hall, the night shift was quiet. None of these people knew that 14 miles beneath the surface of the Earth, stress that had been accumulating along the San Andreas Fault for decades was about to release all at once, along a rupture that would eventually extend nearly 300 miles. The earthquake struck at 5:12 and 6 seconds in the morning. The shaking lasted between 45 and 60 seconds, depending on which account you read. For people who lived through it, the estimates range wildly, because time behaves strangely when the ground is moving. Some survivors described it as less than a minute, some described it as several minutes. What they agreed on was the sound, a deep, sustained roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and the motion, not a single jolt, but a rolling, twisting movement that made standing impossible. Buildings that had seemed permanent revealed themselves as provisional. Unreinforced brick structures, which represented a large portion of the city's commercial building stock, collapsed almost immediately. The shaking knocked chimneys off houses across the city, which, in a city full of wood-burning stoves, was the beginning of the fire problem before the shaking had even stopped. City Hall, which had taken 20 years and $6 million to build, lost most of its facade in the first seconds. The dome remained standing over a skeleton of steel and rubble that made the building look like a ruin from ancient Rome. Photographs of it taken later that day are among the most haunting images from the disaster, because the dome, continuing to stand over the wreckage, seemed to insist on something that the wreckage itself was contradicting. The Palace Hotel, where Caruso was sleeping, survived the earthquake itself with relatively minor structural damage. He reportedly dressed quickly and went out into the street, where he stood looking at the damage and, according to his own account, said something in Italian that translates roughly to, "The earth doesn't want me here anymore." He left San Francisco on the first available transportation and never returned. Within 30 minutes of the earthquake, the fires had started. The earthquake had broken gas mains across the city. It had knocked over wood stoves and fireplaces. It had shorted electrical wiring. The combination produced ignition points in dozens of locations simultaneously, and the fires began to grow. Under ordinary circumstances, a city fire department could have contained most of them, but the earthquake had also broken the water mains. When firefighters arrived and connected their hoses to the hydrants, the pressure was insufficient or absent entirely. The water simply wasn't there. Fire Chief Dennis Sullivan had understood this problem for years. He had been requesting funding for a saltwater pumping system that would allow firefighters to draw water directly from the bay, regardless of the condition of the freshwater system. The request had been made, acknowledged, and not funded. Sullivan himself was critically injured in the first minutes of the earthquake, when a chimney from an adjacent building crashed through the roof of the fire station where he was sleeping. He died 4 days later, without regaining consciousness. The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 was the event that made everything else possible. The canal connected the Hudson River to the Great Lakes, opening a water route from the port of New York all the way to the interior of the continent. Goods that had previously been impossible or prohibitively expensive to transport could now move relatively cheaply between New York and the rapidly expanding settlements of the Midwest. New York became the point through which the produce of an entire continent flowed to the markets of the world. The commerce that followed was staggering in its scale and its speed. The port expanded, the merchant houses multiplied, the banks grew, the population doubled and doubled again as people poured into the city looking for work in the warehouses, on the docks, in the factories that began to appear as the century progressed. The immigrants came from everywhere, but they came most heavily from Ireland and Germany in the middle decades of the century. The Irish, driven by the famine that killed 1 million people and displaced millions more between 1845 and 1852, arrived in numbers that transformed the city's character almost overnight. They settled in neighbourhoods that already existed and created new ones, in the overcrowded tenements of the Lower East Side and Five Points, in conditions that were by most accounts genuinely terrible. The city that received them was not always welcoming. Nativist movements that viewed the new Catholic immigrants with deep suspicion had been present in New York for decades and grew more organised and more aggressive as the immigrant numbers increased. The tension between established residents and new arrivals was a permanent feature of New York's 19th century, a conflict that repeated itself with each new wave of immigration, with each new group of people who arrived speaking a different language and practicing different customs and competing for the same jobs and the same housing. This is one of the things that is true about New York, that the celebratory version of the city's history sometimes softens. The city was built by immigrants, genuinely built by them, in every physical and economic sense. It was also frequently hostile to them, in ways that were sometimes violent and sometimes merely grinding, and always present. The Civil War came to New York not as a battlefield, but as a crisis of loyalty and economics. The city's commercial ties to the cotton-producing South were deep and complicated. New York banks had financed southern plantations. New York merchants had profited from the trade in southern cotton. When the war began, there were voices in the city arguing for accommodation with the Confederacy, or even for New York to declare itself a neutral, free city. Those voices were ultimately drowned out by the war itself, but the draft riots of July 1863 revealed the depth of the city's divisions. When the federal government implemented a draft that allowed wealthy men to pay $300 to avoid service, a sum that was beyond the reach of most working-class New Yorkers, the resentment that had been building for years exploded. The riots lasted 4 days. They were the deadliest urban civil disturbance in American history. The violence was directed largely at the black community of New York, people who had nothing to do with the policy that had ignited the anger, but who represented, in the minds of the rioters, the cause for which they were being asked to fight and die. The city survived the riots. It survived the war. And when the war ended, it entered a period of growth so rapid and so dramatic that it transformed not just the city, but the idea of what a city could be. The decades between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the 20th century are the years when the physical New York that still exists today was largely constructed. The Brooklyn Bridge opened in 1883 after 14 years of construction. It was, at the time of its completion, the longest suspension bridge in the world and a genuine engineering marvel. The chief engineer, John Roebling, had died of an injury sustained in an accident at the bridge site before construction was well underway. His son, Washington Roebling, took over and then was incapacitated by decompression sickness contracted while working in the pressurized caissons that formed the bridge's foundations. He directed the final years of construction from his apartment in Brooklyn Heights through a telescope,
communicating his instructions through his wife Emily, who had educated herself in engineering to serve as his intermediary. The bridge connected Manhattan and Brooklyn in a way that was both practical and symbolic. It demonstrated that the city could build things at a scale that had not previously been attempted. It made clear that New York was operating on a different level of ambition than most other American cities.
I think about the people who built Chartres. They raised a structure in 26 years that has stood for 8 centuries. The nave is 121 feet high. The walls are almost entirely glass, held in place by stone ribs and flying buttresses that still function without modern reinforcement. The building survived 2 world wars, multiple revolutions, and centuries of French weather. When modern engineers have studied it, they found tolerances in the stonework that rival 20th century construction standards. The builders didn't have computers or laser levels. They had geometry passed down through the guild, practical knowledge accumulated over centuries, and they built something that measurably changed the state of every human body that entered it, through sound, through light, through chemistry, through proportions that the nervous system registers even when the conscious mind doesn't notice. We have lost the ability to build what they built, not because we lack the tools. We have tools they never imagined. We've lost it because we dismantled the knowledge system that made it possible. The 7-year apprenticeship that transmitted empirical observation across generations, the guild that held the accumulated understanding of how materials behaved, how sound moved through stone, how light changed across different seasons, the connection between the builder and the building that came from a lifetime spent inside both. When the guild system was dismantled and replaced with wage labour, with patents, with the factory model of production, something was lost that we haven't replaced. We can measure the frequencies inside Chartres now. We can analyse the glass with spectrometers. We can confirm that the building does what the builders intended it to do, but we cannot make another one. The knowledge of how to make another one died in the suppression of the guilds, 2 centuries before we had the instruments to understand what we had lost. My friend visited Chartres last year. She brought a portable decibel meter and a frequency analyzer. She stood in the nave for 20 minutes measuring. Then she put down the equipment and sat in one of the wooden chairs and didn't say anything for a long time. When she came out, she said, "Whatever they were doing, it works." The chair was solid and heavy and very old and still perfectly level, and the questions remain. Why do the acoustic properties of a building constructed in the 12th century match the specifications that modern neurologists would design if asked to create an optimal environment for pain reduction and stress relief? Why was the knowledge of how to produce these effects held in a guild system that was systematically dismantled by the same governments that were simultaneously centralising control over currency, land, and labour? Why do we describe the result as a church, and not as what the acoustic measurements confirm it actually was, a machine for healing, one we don't know how to build anymore, because we destroyed the people who knew? After the war, the city entered a complicated period that lasted for decades. The middle-class white population that had lived in the city's neighbourhoods began moving to the suburbs in large numbers, drawn by the new highways and the new housing developments, and the particular appeal of space and quiet after the density and noise of city life. The city's tax base shrank. The neighbourhoods they left were taken over by new waves of migrants, African Americans from the south, Puerto Ricans and other Caribbean immigrants, people who arrived looking for the same things that every previous wave of immigrants had looked for, and who found a city that was in some ways less able to provide them than it had been in earlier decades. The fiscal crisis of 1975 brought the city to the edge of bankruptcy. The federal government, under President Gerald Ford, initially declined to provide assistance. The Daily News headline that summarised his position, "Ford to City Drop Dead," is one of the most famous newspaper headlines in American history. The city survived the crisis through a combination of painful spending cuts, wage freezes for city workers, and eventually federal loan guarantees. But the experience left a mark on the city's sense of itself that took years to fade. New York rebuilt its confidence slowly through the 1980s and 1990s, driven partly by the financial industry's growth and partly by the cultural energy that has always been one of the city's most reliable resources. The city that exists now is in some ways unrecognisable from the city of the 1970s and in other ways continuous with every version of itself that has come before. The harbour is still there, the density is still there, The noise and the energy and the particular feeling of being in a place where something is always happening are still there. The people who live in it now are as various as they have ever been. More than 200 languages are spoken in New York City. The neighborhoods that were Italian in the early 20th century and Puerto Rican in the mid-20th century are something else now, in the continuous reshuffling that is how New York has always renewed itself. On September 11th, 2001, the city experienced the worst attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. The towers that had defined the southern end of the skyline since their completion in the early 1970s came down in less than 2 hours. Nearly 3,000 people died. The city that had survived the draft riots and the fiscal crisis and decades of difficulty absorbed this loss in the particular way that New York absorbs things, with grief and anger, and eventually with the stubborn insistence on continuing that has always been the city's most fundamental characteristic. The towers that replace them stand now where the original towers stood, and the memorial pools where the foundations used to be hold water that falls continuously into a space that has no bottom visible from above. People stand at the edges of those pools on ordinary weekday afternoons and look down into the falling water and think whatever they think. The city moves around them. There is a moment late at night when you can stand on one of the bridges that cross into Manhattan and look at the island from the outside and see it the way Henry Hudson might have seen it from his ship in 1609. The same water, the same dark shape of land rising from the harbour. Everything else has changed. The forests are gone and the buildings are there instead. The lights of millions of windows reflecting on the water that surrounds the island on 3 sides. The 400,000 people of 1906 have become 8 million, with another 12 million more in the surrounding boroughs and suburbs. The small Dutch trading post has become one of the financial and cultural centres of the world. But the harbour is the same, the position is the same. The fundamental reason the city exists where it exists is the same reason it has always existed there. The deep water, the river reaching inland, the place where goods and people and ideas have been flowing in and out for 4 centuries and show no sign of stopping. New York is not a finished thing. It has never been a finished thing. Every version of it has been a temporary arrangement that the next version improved upon, or replaced or complicated in ways that the previous version had not anticipated. The city does not resolve, it accumulates. Tonight the lights are on across the island. The water is moving in the harbour as it always moves. Somewhere in the city, something is being built. Somewhere, someone is arriving for the first time, standing in the airport or the train station or at the edge of a bridge, looking at the skyline and feeling what 4 centuries of arrivals have felt before them. The city is old enough now to carry its own history in its streets. You can walk through it and feel the layers, the Dutch town under the English city, under the industrial metropolis, under whatever it is becoming now. It is all still there if you know how to look for it. Sleep well. The harbour lights are on. The water is quiet tonight, and the city, as it has always been, is still there in the morning.